It has been a while here since we did a Bible study video. I got to get back in the saddle after the new year. And we left off on my favorite story, one of my favorite stories in John, the woman at the well. And this story is really powerful. We've had some good times at our men's Bible study and talking about all of the ramifications of this story. We did a little bit of the background in the last video, which was like 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago. All of these courtship rituals that show up in the Old Testament with Isaac and Jacob and Moses. And it all starts off with a man coming to the well, meeting a woman, and then asking for a drink. And so that's what Jesus does with this woman. So it fits into that courtship ritual theme here, and it becomes kind of a courtship of a more of a spiritual marriage than it is a physical one. So we're going to dig into it here. So we did the lead in, I think, with verse 4, verse 5, verse 6 in chapter 4, knowing it's Jacob's well, knowing the Samaritans and the Jews. They both honored the Old Testament. The Samaritans only read the Pentateuch, only the first 5 books. They didn't receive the prophets or the other wisdom writings. So Samaritans kind of isolate themselves just in that from the Jews, but they both really honor Jacob. So we're told that, right? This is connecting point. Verse 7, when the Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" And I've talked about this. This is a little bit of a rerun. The disciples had gone into town to buy food. And the Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" And then John tells us Jews do not associate with Samaritans, right? And they're enemies. The Jews destroyed their temple 200 years before this. So she says to Jesus, "What are you doing? I know the Old Testament too. And you asking me for a drink, we're all alone here. This is feeling like a courtship ritual, and this is not right." And then Jesus turns it and says, in verse 10, Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." So Jesus turns it and says, yeah, I'm asking you for a drink, and it fits into this kind of ritual. But if you really knew who I was and what I wanted and what I was willing to give, you would ask me, right? You would have initiated this process. And then he uses this word for living water. And again, a lot like the word anathen in chapter 3 with Nicodemus, it had multiple meanings, like born again, born from above, born anew. This word for living water is the same way. It has multiple meanings here. It can be running water, like a spring, or like a river, or like a spring, but it can mean have a more spiritual sense of being alive. So it's the same game as it was with Nicodemus, with this wordplay. And then so she kind of takes the bait in verse 11 and says, "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water?" Verse 12, "Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and flocks and herds?" So, she kind of goes to the practical, much like Nicodemus did, and said, "Do I have to go back in my mother's womb?" She does the same thing. And she is acting like a rabbi in this way as well, which is interesting. This Nicodemus story in 3 and now her story in 4, they kind of line up, right? And it's interesting that Nicodemus, who is one of the most powerful Jews, he's learned, he's a rabbi, he's all that stuff, right? He's the one who's most likely to have a conversation with Jesus. And she is the least likely person to have a conversation with Jesus. But her conversation goes much better, right? Nicodemus just kind of gets pushed to the side. But Jesus is inviting this woman to have this conversation with him. So we get to see this revolution of who Jesus is really here to connect with, right? It's her, not Nicodemus, when you compare them side by side. So it's interesting that way. So she references Jacob again, which is, Jacob in the well. That's where he met Rebecca and married her. Jacob kisses Rebecca when he first meets her at the well, which is, interesting to think about that point. But Jesus gets back to it. So in 13, he says, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give will never thirst. Indeed, the water that I give will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. And so I'm not gonna pull any punches on this one. And I gave it to the Bible study, our men's Bible study, pretty straight. But basically what Jesus is saying has those connotations of, if it's a marriage proposal that is the form of this, then Jesus says, the gift that I give, I will put in them. And I think it's not pushing it too far to think of it in terms of consummation, that there's, not physical consummation, but it's some type of spiritual consummation that Jesus is talking about. I will put the Spirit in them, right? I will impregnate them with the Spirit, right? This is this whole framework, a reference here. And it will be to eternal life, right? It will give eternal, it will be birthed into eternal life. The woman said, "Sir, give me this water," right? Give this to me so that I won't be thirsty again and I won't have to keep coming here to draw water. So that's verse 15. She says basically, I want that. And in 16, Jesus says, "Go call your husband and come back." Now, people often wonder about why would Jesus talk about her husband here? If we put it in the context of proposal and courtship, it makes complete sense, right? Because, if she's married to somebody else and Jesus is proposing the kind of the spiritual marriage, then there's a sense of, is it this adultery sense of things comes into it, right? And Jesus says in 17, "I have no husband," or she says to him, "I have no husband." And Jesus says, "You are right when you say you have no husband." 18, "The fact is you have had 5 husbands, and the one you are now with is not your husband. What you said is quite true." So here, people sometimes think Jesus is exposing the morality of the woman or something, or the reason that she's maybe not with other women in the town. And that could be true, but it doesn't feel like there's judgment here. And Pastor Kristen said, one of the aspects of why she might have been married and divorced so many times is that she's barren, which fits right into this as a kind of courtship and consummation ritual, that she hasn't had any children. So that would be a reason to divorce, again and again and again. And then she would fit into the long line of barren women who are called by God to have a miracle, right? So Sarah and Hannah and others in the Bible who are barren and too old to have children, and then a miracle happens. This is along those lines, right? She is a woman who, we don't know if she has children, but the idea that if she's been married 5 times, probably hasn't had any male children, which is, the way it was back then. So anyway, the woman then turns the conversation to a different tack, right? She kind of gets it off of her, which is interesting, right, to maneuver that. But I think that when she perceives that he is a prophet and he's connected to God, that she wants to have a different kind of conversation. So she says in 19, "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you are a prophet." Verse 20, "Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place we must worship is in Jerusalem." So she asks this very theological question. And Jesus receives it, right? He is into the rabbinical dialogue with her. He receives this woman who has no power, no learning that we know of, looks to be ostracized by her society. He is bringing her into this conversation as an equal, almost as a rabbi. Again, lifting her up, right? That's what Jesus does here. And so Jesus answers her and says, believe me, woman, and he calls her woman, which goes right back to chapter 2. It's the same address that Jesus gives his mother when he does his first miracle. So those two are connected. Nice connection there. The time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. Verse 22, you Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. 23, yet a time is coming and has now come when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for they are the kind of worshipers that the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and truth. So this is what this is the whole thing that Jesus is giving her, this worshiping in spirit, right? This is what I think Jesus wants to birth, this awareness in the people he's speaking to, into the disciples, and for her. And there's a lot to unpack in this one, and I'm kind of too long already. So I'm just going to leave it here and ask the question, what does it mean to worship in spirit and truth? What does Jesus really mean? He's taking it out of a location and he's putting it in a whole different context about what worship is. So I'll stop there, but this is quite the text here. Keep reading and we'll keep going. Thanks. Bye.